Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberley Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go. Well, welcome. We are literally, I cannot believe this is so exciting. I've been looking forward to this episode all week. We have the amazing Reverend Katie Dunne with us to talk all about scrupulosity and religious obsession. So welcome, Katie.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here and to chat about all things faith and OCD. So thanks for having me.
Yeah. So let me just quickly share. In ERP school, we have this underneath every training, every video, there's a little question and answer. And I'm very confident in answering them. But when it comes to the specifics of religion, I always try to refer to someone who is like an expert. And so this is so timely because I feel like you are perfect to answer some of these questions. Some of the questions we have here are from ERP school. A lot of them are from social media. And so I'm so excited to chat with you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us, before we get into the questions, a little about your story and, why you are here today.
Yeah. So I've navigated OCD since before I can remember, but just like maybe a lot of folks listening, I was very private about that for a very long time. I had a lot of shame around intrusive thoughts. I had a lot of shame around religious obsessions that I had, moral related obsessions, harm obsessions. And this shame particularly came because I was pursuing ministry, and OCD really spiked in the midst of me going to graduate school, going to seminary. And when I was in seminary and I started really struggling, I wanted to seek treatment for the first time and was told really by a mentor that it would not help me to do that in my ministry, that I wouldn't pass my psych evaluations and that I shouldn't pursue treatment, that I needed to keep that on the down low. So as many of us know that might not get that effective evidence-based treatment, I continued to get sicker and had a really pretty full-blown OCD episode in my first role in ministry. So I ended up in school chaplaincy, working with lots of students from different faith backgrounds, some of what we'll be talking about today through an OCD lens. And I was trying to keep my OCD a secret, but in the midst of navigating some difficult tragedies and traumas with students, my OCD latched on to every aspect of what I was navigating. And particularly in the midst of that, I was experiencing losses and mental health crises with students from different faith backgrounds. And when I came out of my own treatment, where exposure and response prevention very much saved my life, I felt like I had an obligation to those students that I worked with to let them know that their chaplain, that their faith leader had gone through mental health treatment and that there was no shame around doing that. And I went from the space in seminary of being told that I shouldn't seek treatment to a space of having families call me for the first time and say, oh, now we can actually talk to you about what's going on in our life. Can you help us talk with our rabbi or our imam or our priest about my child's diagnosis? How can we reconcile faith with treatment? And that opened the door for me to continue this work in a full-time way, where moving from those students that I love so much, I now work in the area of faith and OCD full-time, helping folks navigate religious scrupulosity and very much lean into evidence-based treatment while also reconnecting with their faith in ways that are value-driven to them and not dictated by OCD.
It makes me teary just to hear you say like that folks were saying, well, now I can share with you. Like, it's so interesting to me. I think of a reverend as like, you can go to them to anything, and for them to say that you're disclosing opened some doors, that's incredible.
Mm-hmm. And particularly, I worked really heavily with my Hindu and Muslim students, and we had the chance to do some really awesome mental health initiatives for the South Asian community, where students started then doing projects actually in their own faith communities and opening up about their own journeys and then giving others space to do the same. And I think about the work I do now, which is very much across faith traditions around OCD. And every person I work with, I think of those awesomely brave students who started to come to me after my disclosure and say, okay, we want help. And also we want to share our stories. And that continues to inspire me.
So cool. It leads me to my first question, which is, for OCD, religious scrupulosity, have you found, and I definitely have, that it goes outside of just the Christian religion? I know we hear a lot about just the Christian religion, but can you kind of give me your experience with some of the religions you've had to work with?
So I always tell folks OCD is OCD is OCD, and it always loves to latch on to those things that are the most significant and important to us. So it makes a lot of sense that that would happen with our faith tradition, whether you're Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or Sikh or Jain or beyond, or even atheist or agnostic, can really transform into anything, particularly from what you might be hearing from faith leaders. And I always go back to this idea that OCD is just really gross ice cream with a lot of different gross flavors. And those flavors might be in the form of the Christian faith or in the Jewish faith or in the Muslim faith. But the really big commonality is the fact that it's not about what a person actually believes. Just like with everything else, with OCD, this is very much ego dystonic. It's taking their beliefs, it's twisting them, and it's actually pushing them further away from the tradition. So it's just some examples that we see, of course, in Christianity. You all might be familiar with obsessions around committing blasphemy against the Holy Spirit, or fear of going to hell, or fear of sinning in some way. But we also see lots of different things in Islam, whether that's around not being fully focused during Friday prayers, or not doing ritual washing in the appropriate way. In Judaism, we see so many different things around dietary restrictions or breaking religious law. What if I'm not praying correctly? Hinduism, even what if I'm pronouncing shlokas or mantras incorrectly? What if I have done something to impact my karma or my dharma? What if I'm focusing too heavily on a particular deity or not engaging in puja correctly? Or in Buddhism, I see a lot of folks really focusing on, what if I never stop suffering? What if I've impacted my karma in some way? What if I don't have pure intention alongside that action? Right. And then all the way on the other side, we can see with any type of non-theism or atheism, agnosticism, humanism. Well, what if I believe the wrong thing? What if I'm supposed to believe in God? What if I'll be punished for not? So there are all different forms. And then within each faith tradition, I mean, any form possible that OCD could latch onto.
Yeah, absolutely. I think those are some amazing examples. I had once a client who felt his prostrations weren't correct and got stuck, really continuing trying to perfect it. So I think it can fall into any of those religions for sure. So you've already touched on this a little bit, but this was one of the questions that came from Instagram. Just basically, they were saying like, OCD makes me doubt my faith. Like, why does it do that? Do you have any thoughts on specifically why OCD can make us doubt our faith?
Yeah, I mean, OCD is the doubting disorder. And we always say the content is irrelevant, but it definitely doesn't feel like it. I think for anybody navigating OCD, you're most likely in a space of saying, I could accept uncertainty about any theme except the one that I have right now. Mm-hmm. And that's very much true with faith. If your faith is something that's significant to you and at the center of your life, it makes sense that OCD would latch on to that and that OCD would twist that. Particularly because we really don't have a whole lot of certainty around faith to begin with. And where there's a disorder that surrounds uncertainty and doubt, that makes a lot of sense. And yet it's so challenging because we want to be able to answer all of these questions without OCD making us question every single thing we believe.
It's sort of like relationship obsessions too, in that you're probably looking at people across your religious faith hall or wherever going, but they are certain, like, why can't I get that certainty, right? But it's like they've accepted a degree of uncertainty for them to feel certain in it. But when you have OCD, it's so hard to accept that uncertainty piece of it.
And I'm so glad you said that. I actually get this question a lot, and this might be a strange answer for folks to hear from a minister, but I always tell folks, I'm not certain. I have devoted my life to faith traditions. I'm ordained. I'm not certain about anything, including about the divine. I have really strong beliefs. I have strong things that I lean into and practices that are meaningful to me, but it doesn't mean that I have certainty. And often when you hear someone in a faith tradition say that they're certain, I don't think it means the same thing as what we're thinking it means from an context. They are accepting some level of uncertainty.
Yeah, that's why I compared it to relationship. Like if you're in relationship OCD, you're like, but I'm not sure if I love my partner enough. And everybody else is really certain. But when you really ask them, they're like, no, I'm not completely certain. Like I'm certain for today or whatever it may be. So I think that is very much a typical trait of OCD in that it requires 100%. Okay, so this is actually really one of the first common questions we get when we're doing psychoeducation with clients, which is, why do I have a fear that God will punish me for my intrusive thoughts? Do you want to share a little about that?
Yeah, I mean, there are so many layers with this. And again, latching on to what's the most important, but also latching on to particular teachings, whether it's in a church or a mosque or a synagogue, where I always say there are particular scriptures, particular teachings, particular sermons where you might hear things that relate to punishment in some way or relate to rigidity. But I think folks with OCD hear those through a very different lens than maybe someone else in that congregation. And we might hear something once at age 5 or 6, and for the rest of our lives latch onto this idea that we're doing something wrong or that God is going to punish us. We tend to always see everything through that really negative lens and maybe miss all of the other things that we hear about compassion and about love and forgiveness. And I think there's also this layer for individuals with OCD often holding themselves to a higher standard than everyone else. And that includes the way that they see God as viewing them. So I'll often ask folks, how do you imagine God viewing a friend in this situation? Just like we might do a self-compassion work. And they're like, well, I believe God would be really forgiving of my friend and that they might not be perfect, but that they were created to live this beautiful life. And then when asking the same thing about themselves, but God called me to be perfect and I have to do all of these things right. And I think there's this, I'll often ask folks, what does it look like to see yourself through the same loving eyes through which God sees you, or which you imagine that God sees those around you, which is something we don't often do with OCD.
And what would they often say?
Well, I'll actually use self-compassion practices to turn things around. And I'll say, I'll ask someone to name 3 kind things about themselves and then to put their hand over their heart and actually say it through the lens of God saying that to them. So I'll have them say something like, the divine created me to be compassionate. The divine believes that I am a kind person. The divine wants me to have this beautiful life and to be a good runner or a good baseball player, or whatever that is. And it's always really difficult at the beginning, just like any self-compassion practice. And then I'll watch folks start to smile and say, well, maybe God does see me in that way. maybe God did create me in a beautiful way.
And it's bringing them back to their religion and their faith when they do that, which is so beautiful, isn't it? Okay. This question is very similar, but I really think it was important to address is there are some scriptures where people hear that they aren't allowed to fear or that they must turn their fears over to God. Do you have any thoughts or, responses that you would typically use for that concern?
Yeah, I think, it looks very different across faith traditions and across scriptures, and individuals, of course, view scripture in very different ways, depending on their denomination or depending on their sect. But I think sometimes, unfortunately, those scriptures are used out of context. We see this often where there might be a particular verse that's pulled that from a translation perspective isn't necessarily really about anxiety in the same way that we're defining anxiety through an OCD lens, or isn't really about intrusive thoughts in the way that we're defining it through the lens of OCD. And I think it's really unfortunate when we hear religious leaders or folks in communities say, well, you aren't allowed to fear, or if you just prayed a little bit harder, your anxieties would be able to be turned over to God. And I think we're hearing that, or they're using that in maybe a different way than the passage was intended. And then we're hearing this through a whole nother layer where it actually could be flipped. And instead, when you're saying, don't fear, I always tell folks, so what does it look like instead to not fear treatment, or to do it even if you're afraid, to ask God to give you strength in the midst of that fear and to approach that in a different way? But I think sometimes those who are taking particular passages out of context might not fully understand the weight of OCD or what comes with that condition.
Right. I love that. Thank you for sharing. That was actually the most common question. I think so, like 4 or 5 people asked the same question. So I know that's such an important question that we addressed. Quite a few people also asked how to differentiate, like, you know, with OCD treatment, it's about sort of understanding and being aware of when OCD is present and how it plays its games and its tricks and its tools that it uses. How would people know whether something is OCD or actually in line with the rules of their faith? Do you have any sort of suggestions for people who are struggling with that?
Yeah. So I'll actually often show folks a chart when we start to work together, and we'll put things in different buckets of what are things that you're doing because they are meaningful, because they bring you hope, because they bring you comfort, because they bring you joy. And then on the other hand, what are things that you're doing out of fear, out of anxiety, things that feel urgent, things that are really uncomfortable? And of course, there is never any certainty around anything, which is very much one of the tricky parts with treatment, right? We want to have certainty. But I invite folks to really make the assumption that probably those things that bring joy and meaning and hope and passion and connection are the authentic versions of their faith versus the things that we're doing out of fear or anxiety. You know, I was doing a training a couple months ago for clinicians in this area, and I was talking about how, you know, we don't necessarily want folks to pray out of fear. And someone had a really great question. They said, okay, but if a plane is going down and someone's praying because they're afraid, like, that's not because it's OCD. And I'm like, no, that's very true. But in that situation, they are praying because they're afraid to bring meaning and hope. They're not praying because they're afraid of not praying. And there's a very big distinction there. Are you doing the practice because you're afraid of not doing it, or you're afraid of not doing it perfectly? Or are you engaging in that practice even in moments that are tough in order to bring you peace and meaning and joy and comfort?
And that maybe I've got this wrong, so please check me on this, but it feels like too, when people often ask me that similar question, but not around praying, of like, but if there is a problem, shouldn't I actually do something about it? And I'm like, well, that's a difference between doing something about something when there is an actual problem compared to doing something because maybe something might happen in the future, right? It's such a trick that OCD plays, as it gets you to do things just in case. So would that be true of that as well?
Yeah. I often tell folks, just again, because it's just another form of OCD that's latching on to something that's significant, very similar. I tell folks, if it's really a problem that you need to address, most likely you would do it without asking the question to begin with. But I think the unfortunate thing, that the other example I give is, well, if we think most traditions, we think of God as a parent figure. And I ask folks who are parents to imagine their relationship with their own child. And do you want your child to connect with you throughout the day out of meaning and out of hope and out of a genuine desire for love, or because they're afraid of not talking to you? And those are two very, very different things.
Right. As like a disciplinarian figure. Yeah. That's a really great example. I love that. Yeah. Okay. This was one of the questions that I got, but it's actually one of the cases that I have had in my career as well, which is around the belief that thoughts are equal to deeds, right? Like that if I think it, it must mean I like it, or I want it, or I did it. Can you give some perspective to that from in specifically related to religious obsessions?
Yeah, this can be really hard for folks. And of course, with OCD, thought action fusion is really challenging anyway. And there's often for folks in a faith context, this belief that because I had this thought, because I had what might be perceived as a sinful thought, I must be committing blasphemy, or I must be committing this particular sin. And that can make it really, really tough to do diffusion work with your clinician, because it feels like, well, I had this thought, so it must actually mean that I've done this thing that's in opposition to God. And I always tell folks, I'm not, of course, going to reassure you fully that those two things are completely separate, but I would invite you to lean into the possibility that a thought is just a thought. Just like any other aspect of OCD, we have a bajillion different thoughts a day that pass into and out of our minds. And I actually think from a faith perspective, it's pretty cool that our brains produce a lot of different thoughts, that we see things and that we make particular associations. I'll tell folks like, way to go, God, this is pretty cool. We see things and we make all sorts of connections. But having a thought does not equate to a particular action. And even if we're looking in the form of most scriptures, it's really referencing things that we're doing, ways that we're actually engaging with those thoughts, ways that we're taking that into our action. And again, sometimes from the pulpit, you might hear someone talk about thoughts or intrusive thoughts in ways that are not equivalent to how we're talking about them through an OCD lens, something very different. And they're really talking about more of an intentional act and something that you're doing as opposed to what we're thinking about. It's just a biological process of thoughts moving through your mind.
And would I be right in clarifying here, is it important to differentiate between a thought you had compared to a thought that's intrusive? Is that an important piece, or do we not need to go to that level?
So in the religious context, I don't know. I mean, I'm curious what you think from a clinical, I go back to thoughts are thoughts are thoughts, and they are intrusive because we're labeling them as intrusive.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, sometimes in religious context, and I hear this a lot, someone might go to I hear actually from sermons all the time where someone is saying that intrusive thoughts are in some way sinful, and really what they're thinking are just regular thoughts that people are giving value to. And it makes it really challenging for folks where they're giving more value to their thoughts and then thinking, well, my preacher said that if I have a thought that's quote unquote bad, that it means something about me.
Yeah. I think you just hit the nail on the head. There's when we apply judgment to a thought as good or bad, then we're in trouble, right? That's when things start to go sticky. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Okay. Let's talk about specific exposure examples. I know for those listening, we have done an episode with Jed C. I will link that in the show notes. He did go over some, but I just love for you to go over like, what are some examples of exposures and how might we approach exposure and response prevention specifically related to these religious obsessions?
Yeah. So I always tell folks I'm not a clinician, but I work alongside a lot of really amazing clinicians in religious scrupulosity to develop exposure hierarchies. And one of the big fears when I'm working with someone is often, how could I possibly engage in exposure and response prevention? Because what if someone asked me to do something that's in opposition to my faith? And I want to go ahead and just put that out on the table right now. I know that's a big fear. And I want you to know that a good OCD specialist or an ERP therapist is really going to work with you not to go against or to oppose your faith, but to do some things that are a little bit uncomfortable in service of you being able to get back to your faith in a value-driven way. I really believe we are never going to be incredibly excited about exposures. When I was on my own exposure and response prevention journey, I never once walked into the office and said, yes, I get to do this really scary exposure today. It's going to be so fun. Well, I guess I did say that because my therapist made me pretend to be excited about exposure. So that's like a different that's a different conversation. It was not necessarily genuine. So I'll often ask folks, I know that this isn't something that you want to do, but why don't you want to do it? And if the answer is, well, I'm afraid that it might upset God, or I'm afraid something bad might happen, probably a good exposure. If the immediate response is, well, no, I'm not going to do that. No one else in my tradition would do that. That's completely in opposition to everything we believe. Probably not something that we would ask you to do. And often clinicians will use the 80-20 rule of what would 80% of the folks within your congregation be willing to do. And that can be really helpful working with a faith leader as well, or with other folks within your particular sect or denomination to establish that. At the same time, there Oh my goodness. So many different exposures that we can go into. But a lot of things that I see folks commonly working on are things like praying imperfectly, maybe speaking a blasphemous thought aloud or thinking through that in an intentional way, writing an aspect of that, not completing ritual washing again and again, only doing it once, and even thinking through the fact that it might not have been perfect that time, or maybe even intentionally diverting your attention in the midst of a prayer. Sometimes for folks who are avoiding scripture, that is intentionally reading that aspect of scripture and then maybe thinking intentionally about something that they've thought as a bad thought or that they've defined in that way. But again, it very much depends for each person. And I really want folks to know that it doesn't mean that you are going to be asked to eat something that goes against your dietary restrictions or to deface a religious text. Those are the two things I hear folks very fearful of. And that isn't something that you need to do in order to get better. It's about having conversation and handing over the keys to your clinician to do some uncomfortable stuff in favor of getting back to your faith in a value-driven way.
Yeah, I love that. I'll tell a quick story. When I was a new intern treating OCD, having no clue really what I was doing, I'm very happy to disclose that was the facts. But I had amazing supervisors, and I grew up in an Episcopalian denomination, and I had a client who was similar denomination in the Christian faith. And my supervisor said, well, okay, you're going to have him go and say the blasphemous words. And in my mind, this being my first case, going like, are we allowed? Like side eye, like what? And he said, okay, this is your first go round. I want you to ask your client to go and speak with their religious leader and say, this is what I'm struggling with. And I have this diagnosis and this is the treatment. It's the gold standard. And Kimberly's going to go with you. And do we have permission to proceed? And the minister was so wonderful. He said, if that is what's going to bring you closer to your faith, go as hard as you can. And for me, it was just such a beautiful experience as a new clinician to have. He knew nothing about OCD, but he was like, if that's what you need to do to get closer, go. Like he had so much faith himself in, I know it'll bring you to the right place. And so it's so beautiful for me. And that kind of helped me guide my clients to this day. Like go and get permission, speak to your minister if that helps you to move forward. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, and this is really my favorite thing that I get to do with folks. In addition to working with clinicians and clients and developing exposures, I'll also, in faith traditions that are not my own, but that I might have studied, make connections to other faith leaders so we can talk about what makes the most sense in this particular sect so that someone can fully live into their faith tradition while maybe being a little uncomfortable in this moment or doing something tough. And I deeply believe whatever that looks like for you, even if the exposure seems a little bit scary, that God can handle our exposures. Across faith traditions, we see the divine as this big, wonderful, powerful, all-knowing force. And with everything going on in the world, I deeply believe theologically that the exposure that we're doing over here, which might seem really hard for us, that God can handle that as a way for us to get back to doing the things that we were actually created to do. And in that way, similar to the minister that you talked with that said, hey, go for it. I'll even tell folks I see ERP as a spiritual practice, because a spiritual practice is defined as anything that helps you to reconnect or get closer with the divine. And in that way, doing ERP really does that, because it's breaking down the OCD so that you almost stop worshiping OCD and actually reconnect with God in a way that's value-driven for you. That's actually what I'm getting ready to start my doctoral research on, is actually redefining ERP as a spiritual practice across faith traditions in ways that are accessible for a diverse population.
That's so beautiful. I love that. Okay, this is actually the last question, but this is actually the one I'm most excited to ask. This is actually from someone I deeply care about. They have written in and said, when I get anxious, I try to submit it to God, knowing of his love and power. So by writing a script, which is an ERP practice, for those of you who don't know, it seems I'm in conflict with my religious belief. Do you have any final points you want to make about that?
Yeah. So two big things. One, going off of what I was just sharing a second ago, I would encourage you to know or maybe not to know for sure. We can lean into uncertainty around this, right? But to accept all of the uncertainty while also leaning in and believing that God can handle this difficult script that you're writing or this difficult exposure that you're doing in favor of you getting to live the life that you were created to live, not defined by OCD. And that you still can pray and ask for God's support as a part of that. I would never ask someone not to continue to connect with God during sometimes the most difficult process of their life, which treatment can be. I know it was for me. It was incredibly scary. But rather than asking for reassurance or asking for God to undo any of that exposure work we're doing or saying, oof, disregard the script I just did. We're not going to do any of those things. But rather, I would invite you to say, in whatever way makes sense to you, dear God, please help me to lean into the uncertainty. Please help me to sit with this discomfort associated with this exposure on the way to getting back to this big, beautiful, awesome life that you've created me to live. It's really hard right now. This is really tough, but please walk with me as I sit with all of it, helping me not to push away that anxiety, but rather to be with it as I reclaim my life. Amen. Or something of that nature. Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Really, I get teary again. This is such a beautiful conversation. Okay. So number one, thank you so much for coming on. Really, it's a blessing to have you here. And, I think this will help so many folks. Is there something that we didn't cover that that point that you just made alone, I feel like is like mic drop, but is there anything else you want to add before we finish up?
And this is a little bit more Christocentric, but I think it goes across faith traditions. I often talk about the recovery trinity, and just to leave folks with this as well, that I deeply believe that it's possible to have faith in yourself, faith in the divine, and faith in your treatment all at the same time. And that those three pieces coming together, allowing those to be together, actually can be a huge key with religious scrupulosity and taking a step towards your life during treatment.
That's beautiful. I've never heard that before. That is so beautiful. I'll be sure to get my staff all trained up in that as well. Thank you. Oh, Katie.
Oh, sorry. One more thing. Sorry. As I say that, and I know we're closing out, I also always want folks to know that ERP, this really is my last thing, I promise.
No, go for it. You've got the mic, go.
No, I've worked with a lot of folks across traditions with religious group, and I would say a majority of the folks that I've worked with have moved through ERP and at the other side actually have a deeper relationship with their faith than maybe they did before. And I would encourage you to hear that actually leaning into that uncertainty translates far beyond OCD, sometimes into a closer relationship with God. And I've worked with folks who have moved through ERP that end up going into ministry because that's meaningful to them in a way that isn't driven by OCD. So just knowing that it doesn't ever mean you're stepping away from your faith, you're taking actually this leap of faith to reconnect with it in a way that's actually authentic to you.
That is I'm so grateful that you added that. Isn't that so the truth with OCD in general? Like the more you want certainty, the less of it you have. And the more you let go of it, the more you can kind of have that value-driven life. I love it. Okay. I can't thank you enough. Really, this has been such a beautiful conversation. I probably nearly cried like 4 times, and I don't often get to that. It's just so beautiful and deep, and I think it's wonderful. Thank you. Where will people hear about you, get to know you, reach out to you, and so forth?
So folks are more than welcome to reach out to me via Instagram at RevKRunsBeyondOCD or on my website at revkatiodunne.com. I do lots of work, again, with clinicians and faith leaders and clients, but also have free weekly Faith and OCD support groups, along with interfaith prayer services for folks navigating what it means to lean into their faith traditions from a space of uncertainty and an inclusive environment. And then I would also encourage folks to check out our upcoming Faith and OCD conference with the IOCDF in May, along with a really awesome resource page that we were so proud to put out last year. I had the chance to work with a really great team of clinicians and faith leaders to create a resource page for all of you to see what scrupulosity might look like in your faith tradition, along with resources. So check out all of those wonderful things.
Amazing. We'll have all that linked in the show notes. Thank you, Katie. Really, it's such an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you. This was lovely. Thank you so much.
Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.